Ah, yes, Trials and Tribble-ations, the clever, light-hearted, and affectionate tribute to classic Star Trek that inadvertently opened Pandora's box. This is a review of the classic Star Trek Deep Space Nine episode, Trials and Tribble-ations. If you have not seen this episode and you don't want to know what happens in it, be warned, spoilers beyond this point. This is a good episode. This is a fun episode. I like this episode a lot. I don't blame this episode or the people who made it for the fact that it set precedents which, a few decades down the line, led to some of the worst Star Trek ever produced, as well as some of the whiniest, most entitled fan tantrums ever loosed upon the internet. I'm going to spend most of this review talking about the good stuff, that being the episode itself, and I'll restrain myself to releasing only a drop or two of acid right at the end. Deal? Deal. Trials and Tribble-ations was conceived as a celebration of classic Star Trek to mark the 30th anniversary of the franchise. The other episodes I'm reviewing in this set of shows featuring guest stars from previous Trek series feature individual actors reprising characters. Leonard Nimoy as Spock in Unification, James Doohan as Scotty in Relics, etc. Trials and Tribble-ations ups the ante significantly by featuring as its guest star an entire episode of Star Trek The Original Series. Using a combination of matching costumes and sets, clever editing, and skillfully deployed special effects, Trials and Tribble-ations depicts the heroes of Deep Space Nine traveling back in time, not just to the era of classic Trek, but into one of its most well-known and beloved episodes, The Trouble with Tribbles. The plot is blessedly straightforward, little more than a pretense to explain why the DS9 crew is wearing TOS-style costumes and running around on Kirk's Enterprise, and it goes a little something like this. While visiting Cardassia to pick up a Bajoran orb of the prophets that has recently been discovered, the Defiant also picks up a passenger, a human named Barry, who claims to be a merchant who was trapped on Cardassia when the Klingons invaded the previous year. Barry, it turns out, is actually Arn Darvin, the Klingon who posed as a human in order to sabotage Federation colonization efforts by poisoning a shipment of grain in The Trouble with Tribbles. After he was exposed as a secret agent by Captain Kirk, life didn't go so well for him. So, the first chance he gets, he uses that Bajoran orb, which turns out conveniently enough to be the Orb of Time, and uses it to take the Defiant back in time so he can kill Captain Kirk and prevent his own ruination. By the time Sisko's crew figure any of this out, they've already gone back in time, and Barry/Darvin has beamed himself off of the Defiant, landing either on the Enterprise or the space station, K7, which the Enterprise is visiting. Our heroes split into two teams, with Sisko, Dax, O'Brien, and Bashir beaming over to the Enterprise to search for Darvin there, while Odo and Worf beam over to K7 to do the same. O'Brien and Bashir meet a pretty lady who just transferred to the Enterprise, who flirts with Julian and convinces him that she is his own great-grandmother and that he is destined to sleep with her and become his own great-grandfather. O'Brien, perhaps wanting to spare his friend the psychic trauma associated with trying to fuck his own grandma, cuts this off as quickly as possible, and the scene ends with a great line where an exasperated Bashir tells O'Brien, "I can't wait to see the look on your face when we get back to Deep Space Nine and you find out I never existed." Meanwhile, Sisko and Dax are elsewhere on the Enterprise looking for Darvin, with Sisko having the added job of stopping Dax from humping the bulkheads. As a Trill who has lived several lifetimes, Dax remembers this era of history, you see, and she really misses it. And kind of wants to fuck it, like Bashir wants to fuck his grandma. There are a lot of inappropriate sexual urges in this episode. I never realized. Then Captain Kirk and Spock walk by, and we see that Dax also has an urge to fuck Spock, and that one is appropriate at least. Meanwhile, on K7, Odo has discovered Tribbles, much to the annoyance of Worf, who informs Odo that Tribbles are an enemy of the Klingon Empire, an ecological menace, the ultimate invasive species that shows up and does nothing but eat, and reproduce and overrun everything else. And it is for that reason that a Klingon armada found and destroyed the Tribble homeworld in the late 23rd century. God damn, Klingon environmentalists do not mess around, do they? Eventually, O'Brien and Bashir join Odo and Worf on K7, where they get caught up in the famous Trouble with Tribbles humans versus Klingons bar fight, which ends with them spotting Darvin in the background as Cyrano Jones hams it up milking his taking a drink shtick. Odo and Worf catch Darvin and take him back to the Defiant. O'Brien and Bashir are nabbed by security and wind up back on the Enterprise, lined up with the others to get grilled by Captain Kirk, a memory O'Brien will treasure all the rest of his days. Once arrested, Darvin gives up his scheme pretty much immediately, I guess because he, like all action-adventure villains, assumes it's too late for the heroes to stop him. He has planted a bomb in a Tribble, and when it explodes, Kirk will be killed. Sisko and Dax go to the bridge of the Enterprise and use the ship's sensors to determine that the Tribble bomb isn't there, meaning it must be on Station K7. Dax also catches a glimpse of Dr. McCoy and confirms that not merely does she want to fuck him, she has fucked him, as one of her previous hosts, who got to know the good doctor in his younger days on Earth. Sisko's like, okay, let's go before you start grinding on the big red railing. Everyone beams over to K7 to concentrate the search there. Sisko and Dax take the storage compartment where the poisoned grain is being held and manage to find the Tribble bomb just as Captain Kirk shows up, opens the compartment, and is buried up to his waist in dead Tribbles, creating the most simultaneously whimsical and macabre image in all of Star Trek. Sisko calls Major Kira on the Defiant and has her beam the bomb out into space in the nick of time, and from there, everything happens the way it was supposed to happen, except for a tiny indulgence from Sisko, who heads up to the bridge of the Enterprise one last time to deliver a duty roster to Kirk and tell the legendary captain what an honor it is to serve with him. Then we return to the present day, where Sisko has been relating this story to a couple of agents from the Department of Temporal Investigations, and as soon as the agents leave, we get a cute final reveal that Odo apparently kept his Tribble, and it did what Tribbles do, and now DS9's promenade is Tribble country. I know just the man to solve that problem. This is a fun episode. It's playful, it's unpretentious. It's also shamelessly gimmicky, but it gets away with it by knowing just how to work the gimmick and by not overdoing it. The visual effects techniques used to Forrest Gump the Deep Space Nine characters into pre-existing shots from Trouble with Tribbles are very impressive, but they aren't quite seamless. Even if you've never seen the original Trouble with Tribbles, you can tell something fishy is going on when we see Odo in the background behind Uhura and Chekhov at the K7 bar, or O'Brien and Bashir in line with the others as they're being interrogated by Kirk. That being the case, the creators of Deep Space Nine chose the perfect episode of classic Trek to do this with. If they tried to do an episode where Sisko's crew found themselves in the middle of, say, the Corbomite maneuver or Balance of Terror, the obviousness of the gimmick would undercut the drama. Because Trouble with Tribbles is originally a comedy, our awareness of the visual trickery being used to create trials and tribulations doesn't detract from the desired effect of the episode. It actually adds to it. And for me, some of the most impressive examples of that visual trickery are also the most basic. There are several shots where DS9 characters are composited into actual shots from Trouble with Tribbles. One of my favorite moments from the episode is accomplished through compositing one of the oldest special effects techniques in photography. It's the beat when Dax and Sisko are on the bridge of the Enterprise and Kirk enters and almost sits on a Tribble. He glances over at Dax, who just kind of shrugs. It's a shot from an episode of Star Trek the Original Series and a shot created 30 years later on a different set with an actor who was 4 years old at the time the original shot was filmed. It's simple, it's seamless, it's the epitome of movie magic. A single, cohesive moment assembled from elements created by different people decades apart. Perhaps the most important reason why this episode works so well is that it's funny. And its humor is nicely balanced between cute Star Trek in-jokes and gags that touch on other things. I love the interplay between O'Brien and Bashir in the turbo lift, the panic that momentarily grips Bashir when he thinks he may have just met his own great-grandmother, and the irritation with which O'Brien puts a stop to it, as if to say, no, that will not be a subplot in this episode. There's enough going on already. I love the quiet little nope moments that Avery Brooks gets as Sisko when he's forced to pull Dax out of her sexually aroused nostalgia. When Dax first sees Spock and comments on how attractive he is, Sisko realizes what's going on, closes up the maintenance panel he's been pretending to work on, whispers, "Let's go," and leads Dax away, and I've been laughing about that since 1996. Of the Star Trek-specific gags, I really like O'Brien mistakenly believing the nameless nobody sitting at the table with Scotty and Chekhov on K7 is Captain Kirk. Like, he's absolutely convinced that dude is Captain Kirk. And then after the fight, he gets questioned by the real Captain Kirk in a clever payoff. I also love the bit where, again, through nothing more high-tech than some carefully matched edits, Sisko and Dax are in the storage compartment scanning tribbles and tossing them over their shoulders, and we cut to those tribbles falling out of the door and onto Captain Kirk's head. Beautifully done. And so funny. And how can I forget the almost perfect acknowledgement and non-explanation of why the Klingons on K7 look so different from Worf and the other Klingons our DS9 characters are familiar with. Odo, O'Brien, and Bashir look at the classic Klingons, then turn to look at Worf. Worf says they are Klingons, and it is a long story. And the only reason I say almost perfect when describing this bit is that I think it goes on just one step too long. O'Brien and Bashir propose possible explanations for the differences, genetic engineering, viral mutation, and Worf says we do not discuss it with outsiders. Better to just cut that part out. Leave it at, it is a long story, and move on to the next thing. Either way, though, it's a great joke, and the only in-universe explanation for the change in the looks of the Klingons that there should ever have been. This episode is, to employ a phrase that has been grossly overused to excuse almost every instance of overindulgent fan service since, a love letter to Star Trek. It works because it's clever, it's superbly executed, and it's very, very funny. I've got no problems with the episode itself. My problems related to this episode are actually with things that happened much later as a result of it. For example, when Star Trek Discovery debuted and a certain subsection of the fan base lost its mind because the aesthetic of the show didn't match that of classic Trek, even though it was set in roughly the same era. Trials and Tribble-ations cemented the expectation among literal-minded Trekkies that any show depicting events from the TOS era that didn't look exactly like TOS was somehow wrong, as though Star Trek was a historical documentary rather than a work of fiction created by artists who might have their own ideas about how the show they're making ought to look. Trials and Tribble-ations also introduced the idea that Captain Kirk and his crew are famous to characters of the Picard, Sisko, Janeway generation. The episode itself undercuts this with the O'Brien mistakes an extra for Captain Kirk gag, but more people remember the bit near the end, when Sisko arranges a meeting with Kirk, and the earlier bit where Sisko admits to Dax that he is a bit starstruck from seeing Kirk in the flesh and would love to ask him about fighting the Gorn on Cestus 3, suggesting that he has more than a passing familiarity with Kirk's adventures. Here's the thing, there's nothing wrong with that in and of itself. The problem results from subsequent Star Trek writers doing the same thing, forgetting the context in which it was done in Trials and Tribble-ations, namely a one-off lark of an episode produced as an explicit tribute to classic Trek the year of its 30th anniversary. The result being characters in Star Trek who talk and act like fans who watch Star Trek. I try not to use the word hate to describe my reaction to a TV show, but I really don't like that. Fortunately, it hasn't affected my opinion of Trials and Tribble-ations itself. It's not the fault of Trials and Tribble-ations that it gave creators of future Star Trek shows an excuse to do their jobs like fans instead of writers. It's still a terrific episode, and I still have a great time watching it. Those are my thoughts on Trials and Tribble-ations. What do you think of this episode? Please share your thoughts with me in the comments. If you'd like to support this channel, and I sure wish you would, if you can afford it, you can do so by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Steve Shives, becoming a channel member by clicking the join button, or by making a one-time gift by clicking the thanks button, or via PayPal or Venmo. Links are in the description. Don't forget to watch for my review of the series finale of Star Trek Picard. I'm teaming up with my best friend and podcast co-host Jason Harding to review this final season of Picard, and our review of the last episode should be up sometime this weekend, probably Saturday. And please join me again at this time next week for another retro review. The final episode in this batch, dedicated to guest stars from previous series, will be an episode of Star Trek Voyager, an episode that originally aired just 2 months prior to Trials and Tribble-ations, and which was also produced to coincide with Star Trek's 30th anniversary. That Voyager episode is Flashback. I'll see you then. Thanks for watching, and take care, everybody.